2005. A man walks calmly into a courtroom. He's dressed neatly. He greets the judge. He's polite, almost cheerful. He is about to confess to 10 murders, spanning 3 decades. But here's what makes this different from every other case we've analyzed. Nobody forced him to be there. There was no plea deal, no lawyer pressuring him to cooperate. He just wanted to talk. After 30 years of silence, what made the BTK killer choose to confess everything? Today, we're dissecting Dennis Rader's interrogation and confession, beat by beat, through the lens of forensic psychology. By the end of this video, you'll understand the psychological mechanism that made a killer want to be caught, and how that's different from guilt. The specific behavioral tells that appear when someone is confessing out of pride rather than remorse. Why Rader maintained a completely normal life for 30 years, church president, compliance officer, family man, and what psychology tells us about how that was possible. And the single mistake that ended everything. A floppy disk, a metadata trace, and an ego that couldn't stop. This content is for educational and psychological analysis purposes only. All analysis is based on publicly available records, court transcripts, and established forensic psychology research. This does not glorify violence or criminal behavior. Let's go inside the interrogation room. 2 types of confession. When we think about criminal confessions, we tend to imagine one scenario. A detective applies enough psychological pressure until the suspect breaks. That's the Reed technique, the interrogation method taught for decades in American law enforcement, and it assumes that confession is the result of cognitive overload. But forensic psychologists have documented a second, far rarer type of confession, one that investigators almost never prepare for: the voluntary confession. A person who confesses not because they're cornered, but because some part of them needs to. To understand this, you need to know about what psychologists call narcissistic grandiosity. Grandiosity is not simply arrogance. It's a deep, structural belief that one is exceptional, that one's actions, intelligence, or power are too important to remain anonymous. And in violent offenders who exhibit this trait, it creates a psychological tension that can build for years. The need to be known for what they've done. Psychiatrist Robert Hare, who developed the Psychopathy Checklist Revised, the gold standard for psychopathy assessment, described this as a form of credit-seeking behavior. The act isn't satisfying unless someone acknowledges it. The double life, compartmentalization. The second concept we need to understand is compartmentalization. Most people assume that someone capable of extreme violence must look disturbed, must show cracks in their everyday behavior. But the forensic record tells a different story. Psychiatrist Hervey Cleckley documented this decades ago in what he called the mask of sanity, the ability of certain individuals to present a completely convincing surface of normalcy while harboring a radically different internal reality. Dennis Rader was a church president, a compliance officer whose job was literally to enforce city ordinances and tell people they were breaking the rules, a husband and father in a suburban neighborhood, and simultaneously the BTK killer. These were not contradictions to him. They were separate compartments, the same brain, running 2 completely distinct operating systems. This is not a metaphor. Neuropsychological research has found that individuals with high psychopathic traits show reduced connectivity between the prefrontal cortex, responsible for moral reasoning, and the amygdala, responsible for emotional response. The result is a brain architecture that processes moral decisions without the emotional weight that guides most people's behavior. He wasn't fighting his other self. He simply had two of them. Beat 1. The 25 years of silence and why they ended between 1974 and 1991. Dennis Rader committed 10 murders in and around Wichita, Kansas. He sent taunting letters to police and newspapers, giving himself the name BTK, bind, torture, kill. Then, in 1991, he stopped. He went completely silent for 13 years. Forensic investigators later concluded that this wasn't remorse. It was fear of detection, rational, calculated self-preservation. His daughter had been born. His profile in the community had grown. The risk outweighed the reward. But something changed in 2004. A local journalist published a book about the BTK case. A documentary aired, and Rader, watching from his couch, recognized by no one, experienced something that forensic psychologists would later describe as narcissistic injury. The story was being told without him. His work was being discussed by people who didn't understand it. He was being denied credit. He resumed contact with police, not because he had to, because he needed to. Beat 2. The floppy disk. What ego looks like as a crime. In January 2005, Rader sent police a floppy disk containing a document. On it, he asked a question that reveals everything about his psychology. Can the floppy disk be traced to me? Police replied publicly through a newspaper advertisement that floppy disks couldn't be traced. He believed them. Metadata on the disk led investigators directly to a computer at Christ Lutheran Church, Wichita, registered to the church president, Dennis Rader. The behavioral analysis here is critical. A man who had evaded detection for 30 years made an elementary digital mistake. This is not stupidity. This is what happens when grandiosity overrides caution. He believed he was smarter than the investigators. He needed to engage with them. The two impulses combined into a fatal miscalculation. Beat 3. The interrogation room. Behavioral tells of proud confession. When Rader was arrested and brought in for questioning, investigators braced for denial, deflection, legal maneuvering. What they got was the opposite. He was cooperative, almost enthusiastic. He didn't wait to be asked. He provided details. He corrected investigators when they got things wrong. He used a terminology he had invented himself, referring to his victims as projects. This is one of the most documented behavioral signatures of narcissistic grandiosity in violent offenders, the proud confession. Where a typical killer in interrogation works to minimize their role, Rader worked to maximize his. He wanted the record to be accurate. He wanted credit for all 10. Forensic psychologist Catherine Ramsland, who has studied Rader extensively, noted that his demeanor during confession showed almost no markers of guilt or remorse, and significant markers of what she described as performance for an audience he had finally found. His affect was flat, where it should have been emotional, and animated, almost proud, where most perpetrators go cold. Beat 4. The courtroom confession, language as behavioral data. During his formal sentencing hearing, Rader addressed the court at length. He described each crime chronologically, using his own invented vocabulary. He corrected official accounts when he felt they were inaccurate. The judge interrupted him at one point and said something remarkable. You seem almost proud of what you did. Rader's response, according to court transcripts, showed no visible distress at this observation. Forensic linguists who analyzed his statements identified a consistent absence of what they call victim-centered language, language that acknowledges the humanity of those harmed. His framing was almost entirely operational, procedural. His victims were obstacles in a project, not people. This is not theater. This is the language architecture of a mind that genuinely processed those events differently than yours or mine. What Rader tells us about human nature. The people who knew Dennis Rader, his neighbors, his church congregation, his co-workers, were described by journalists as devastated, disbelieving, unable to process it. This is the reaction that almost always follows revelations like this, and it points to something we need to sit with. Our entire system for reading other people may be fundamentally inadequate. We assess character through consistency, through how someone behaves in front of us over time, through reputation, social role, surface behavior. But the Rader case, and cases like his, demonstrate that a segment of human beings can maintain two entirely separate behavioral identities simultaneously, with no behavioral leakage between them, for decades. Not because they're uniquely skilled at lying, but because for them, there is genuinely no contradiction to hide. The compartments don't bleed into each other. This is what makes the BTK case so important for psychology beyond the crime itself. It forces us to ask what character actually is, whether it's a stable internal property or a context-dependent performance that some people can switch on and off with neurological precision. Rader served as a compliance officer. His job was literally to enforce rules, to make sure people did what they were supposed to do. And every evening, he went home to a version of himself that operated by an entirely different set of rules. Not a monster in disguise. Two people, one brain, no internal conflict. That, forensic psychology tells us, is perhaps the most disturbing finding in the entire study of violent behavior. The Rader case raises more questions than it answers, and that's exactly the point. If someone can live a completely convincing normal life for 30 years while committing these crimes, what does that tell us about how we judge people, about character assessment, about the limits of intuition? In the next video on this channel, we're going to explore something even more fundamental: the specific childhood and neurological patterns that appear in the backgrounds of violent offenders. Not to explain away what they did, but to understand what the science actually says about how this begins. If this breakdown changed how you think about human behavior, subscribe to Behavioral Vault. We go where the psychology actually leads, not where it's comfortable. Drop a comment. What surprised you most about Rader's psychology? I read every one. The next video is right here.